Honestly, I just don't understand the point of being able to make your roster change after qualifying for EWC unless there's some extenuating circumstance, like the contract expires or whatever.
I just had three versions of you talking at the same time. What were you saying?
I was like, I don't really get why they're allowed to change rosters for EWC, like especially Orchid, for example, unless Henry got called up to a CDL team.
Yeah, that one doesn't make sense.
Like
We
that
can talk
just
about that.
that's
Yeah,
horrible just in general.
yeah. The the Carolina situation's interesting. I don't know if you watched that clip from Brian Saint, but he basically said that like he got confirmation from every other CDL team that they got their invites and visas and stuff for EWC like around Major Four, and Carolina was allegedly the only team that wasn't notified until champs.
Hmm, that's weird.
Yeah.
Wonder if that's a Carolina issue, like a parent work
Well,
thing.
he said he thought it was might be like like how there's like certain partners and stuff for some organizations, like for the esports World Cup as a whole, like
Mm-hmm.
like Falcons, Hundred Thieves, like orgs that compete in multiple sports. But he confirmed with Boston that Boston got their invite with everybody else, and obviously Boston doesn't have any other teams, so
That's
I
weird.
don't know. Yeah, gotta get a tweet going, then we are good. Um,
I watched that slasher clip when he was on the flank, and I just
yeah.
couldn't understand like what was going on because, uh, like, do they have they been told like why they couldn't just drop two and like because I think Afro said like they were just never even told that they could like they were told they couldn't do three, but they weren't told they could go back down to two or something like that.
Well, so the EWC rule is that you have to have three-fourths of the roster, and Saint said that he uh reached out to them and said we have two guys on expiring contracts, so it's very likely that you know even if we aren't able to sign both of them, that we aren't able to meet this. And he never heard back from them until yesterday when they said that they were denied.
Interesting. I mean, I guess that will change how contracts are probably written if EWC is going to be a
Yeah,
month after champs.
it is kind of interesting though that Carolina is the only team that's seemingly having this issue.
Yeah,
Because I mean, every other team is only making one move. Like if you look at the list, like Cloud9, just Gwen, Vegas new because they only do TJ, LAG's only Diamond Con, Toronto is only one person. So like, it seems like just every other team new except Carolina.
yeah, it doesn't really reflect very well on them.
Nope. Let's do mic check real quick. Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Yeah, we're good there on YouTube. All right, YouTube's good too. Should be good to go.
All right. Hello and welcome to episode 187 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we got some ROSTERMANIA news to talk about after a long 2025 Call of Duty League season. ROSTERMANIA is officially upon us. A third of the league has already made at least one roster move. One of those teams made one or maybe too many roster changes, and we'll get to that. We even have some challenger roster mania stuff, which is kind of a fresh surprise for the Ego Chow podcast. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Been a little bit since we went live for those in the U.S. Hope everyone had a happy and safe Fourth of July weekend and all that stuff. I had a good time. Got to go down and see some of my buddies from college in Jersey and uh, had some fun there. But uh, yeah, some stuff's been going on, and I guess too on that note, I also noticed, just because it is the last time we went live, that the live stream for um, our YouTube. I said that all wrong. The live stream VOD for our YouTube stream of the last episode hit over 1,000 views. So I'm pretty sure it's definitely the most viewed VOD we've had, and definitely our most successful YouTube stream. So anybody who was a part of that, thank you very much. Um, so yeah, it's an exciting time. Obviously, champs, feels like it was a bit ago, but um, we do have another tournament coming up in EWC, and as a result of that, we got some juicy details to talk about before we get into the nitty gritty of all that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about roster mania, but we have to talk about the biggest story as a result of this roster mania, I think, and that is the Carolina Royal Ravens have been disqualified, excluded, however you want to phrase it, but they will not be at Esports World Cup later this month. Obviously, each of the 12 CDL teams received an automatic invite, or seemingly so, into EWC, and the top four challengers teams from challengers finals also were bumped up and invited to EWC. However, I don't know if we really understand or know to the extent of which how much is this on Carolina, how much of this is on EWC, how much of this maybe is on even the CDL, as kind of like, because the CDL is a partner of the EWC, or EWC is a sponsor of the CDL, however it works. But whoever is to blame, the result is that Carolina will not be at EWC. Brian Saint, the head coach and GM of Carolina, said, quote, "I didn't receive a single email back until I received an email that we were denied by EWC." Slasher went on Zuma's podcast, or Zuma's live stream, and talked about the situation. And I think the crux of it is, from what you've told me and what I've gathered from some of the things that I've watched and read, is that Carolina tried to make three roster changes. I shouldn't say that they technically initiated all three of these changes, because two of the players on their roster, their contracts expired. TJ Haley and Gwyn. Both of these players ended up signing with other CDL teams in the past week. TJ goes to Vegas. Gwyn goes to C9 New York, leaving them with two open roster spots. Carolina seemingly then decided to make another change and replace Rex in the roster, bringing in Afro, obviously a former CDL pro, Cobra, who you've discussed quite a bit in the past before as kind of like one of the top European players as well, and F. Dot. So these three players joined Slasher on Carolina. Unfortunately, that may have been the impetus for why they are not going to be at EWC. You said over text message that EWC has and from what you've heard, has a 2-person rule, or maybe even a 3-person rule. Like, you have to retain 3/4 of your roster from, when you qualified to EWC. I'm unsure of like how it would all work out with the contract stuff, but you made a great point before we started recording, is that Carolina is notably the only team having this issue. Every other team that has made a roster change, and there have been 4 other CDL teams and 1 challengers team that is going to EWC, they have each made just 1 change each. So I believe that maybe it is on Carolina. I'd like to get your take on this, because it seems like you're a little more knowledgeable of the situation, or at least have seen or watched more of what's been said. So how do you view this kind of breakdown in communication possibly for Carolina?
Yeah, I don't think it falls solely on Carolina, at least based on what we've heard, but obviously there is a some gap or lack of communication between all the necessary parties involved here, and whether it's Carolina or the Esports World Cup or whoever. Um, a lot of what you just said really came, an hour ago. Breaking Point posted a 4-minute clip of Brian Saint, who's the coach and GM of the Carolina Royal Ravens, talking on the flank. I don't know when that flank episode was. It sounded like it had to have been yesterday, but like I looked on the Flanks Twitter, and I didn't actually see like a tweet of a new video. I didn't check YouTube or anything like that for the Flank, but um yeah. So a lot. Obviously, this is just Brian Saints speaking, so it's his perspective, but I don't see any reason he would have to not be honest about what's going on. But from the sound of it, he was the one where he says that there's apparently a three-fourths roster situation for EWC, which is where I said to you, and that makes sense because you look at all these other teams that we're going to be talking about later today that made changes. They are making one person changes, and they are having or they're retaining three-fourths of their roster from before EWC, and then the one person change is all they are making. Whereas Carolina was in a position with the contracts and what we've heard now, where um, it was most likely going to be difficult for them to meet that requirement, even if they decided to keep Rex on board. Because if TJ and Gwen's contracts were up, then they only have two players contracted. So, bit of a weird situation in that regard. You mentioned it really before we dove into the show here that maybe this could have an impact on how at least Carolina does contracts moving forward, because we can't really say it might affect the whole league if this is only a Carolina thing, based on what we're um, seeing from the moves made by other teams. But the interesting part that I mentioned to you that I saw or heard from Brian Saint in that clip is he claims that Carolina was only notified of their invite to EWC around champs, and allegedly he confirmed with the other coaches and CDL organizations that they all received their invites to EWC um, around Major Four, either before or after Major Four. He said, I can't remember his exact phrasing. And he thought it might have been something to do with, a lot of these other CDL franchises having esports orgs in a partnership program or whatever with the Esports World Cup. um, but he specifically mentioned Boston, which is a team that we know isn't really involved in other esports anymore. They were a part of the group who did in fact receive an invite much earlier than Carolina, at least according to Brian Saint. So that is a little weird. Maybe we've heard about Boston, potentially looking to move on and stuff from last offseason, looking to potentially move on from competing in Call of Duty. We also heard those same rumors around Carolina, so it's not a totally unique situation, but maybe this is just a sign of, you know, like stuff going on behind the scenes with Carolina. Potentially, we've heard the rumors or murmurings of potential other Saudi teams looking to join the CDL. And if Carolina's having issues where, again, can't fully put the blame on Carolina or can't fully put the blame on EWC either without knowing all of the details and exactly what's going on. Um, but there's obviously something going on here that caused this lack of communication, and in the end, it sounds like it is very unlikely that Carolina will be participating in the Esports World Cup, which in the grand scheme of things, that's what I'm most disappointed about. As you mentioned, at least from the outside looking in, like the roster potential of this uh, Carolina team with Afro and Cobra in particular, I was really excited for. I don't really know much about F dot, to be honest. Um, but even beyond that, I think we kind of hit it or talked about it in the champs recap episode. Like, this EWC potentially could have been Slasher's last event if he decides to retire. Um, Now, the interesting place where my mind goes is if Gwen and TJ's contracts were up after champs, but Slashers weren't, then he's potentially signed to, to Carolina beyond this year, which means it's possible he's still competing and doesn't plan on retiring. It's also possible, he does just retire and decides to hang it up after, having to deal with this situation of not getting to compete at a, pretty lucrative event. So there are a lot of ramifications for this, and that would just be the worst part of this, in my opinion, and all, is if we're denied seeing like one last dance from Slasher if it does turn out that he retires. But if he ends up competing next year, then that's a moot point. But yeah, lot of stuff to unpack here, really, with this whole situation.
I was just looking up on the EWC's. It was actually, I think, on the Liquipedia website about who all is competing at EWC, like all the organizations and stuff. And I think that probably is the reason that they weren't told or formally invited as early as the other teams. I think every single team, including Boston, I think, could, like, I guess what I'm trying to say though is Oxygen Esports is on this list as
Okay.
Not having like a team there, but they apparently could qualify or could have qualified for the Rainbow Six tournament. So maybe that just has something to do with it. Like, and I was trying to see if Toronto, which I would imagine it's under, was it Koi? Yeah, so they're there as well. So every other organization in the CDL has something or some kind of connection to the EWC aside from Call of Duty. Carolina does not. Maybe that, or as far as I know, because they're not owned by the Rogue people anymore, if I'm not mistaken, or are they?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I've lost track of that whole situation.
Yeah. So, but maybe that is just the reason why it happened. It's really poor management just in general that they were not aware of like the rules, right? Because it does seem on one hand EWC and the CDL should have been like clearly communicating this stuff to everybody, but when only one of the 12 teams doesn't get the message, you have to at least question if that team just wasn't listening correctly or wasn't connected in the way that other organizations were. It just feels like a silly thing to kind of get tripped up on is, hey, like, we didn't know we couldn't make 3 roster changes. We could only make 1. The contract stuff also is very weird. The fact that, they've had 2 players leave their team for other CDL teams. Like, I don't know. It seems odd. It sucks for the players, obviously. Afro was tweeting about it, and I felt bad for him because he's just like, there's nothing that he could have done. There's nothing that those players really could have done to fix the situation. He said on Twitter, how can they not expect Carolina not to get 2 players after they left because they were out of contract? We've been denied from EWC. Would get it if they were dropped, because then they're making an intentional change, but they didn't make it make sense. And then he later replied, said, assuming 3 players was too many, which I get, we'd have to play with Rex, which is fine, but not allowing them to even have that decision. I think it probably is just the 3/4 rule, and like they can't do it obviously because Vegas has already signed a player, which I'm saying like it warrants the discussion of like if Vegas is kind of Vegas is connected obviously to the EWC more directly than any other organization in the CDL, and they're able to get TJ. I don't know, like it just, conspiracy theory in me, starts to wonder a little bit, but it's just a real weird situation. I don't know if Carolina can do anything about it. It seems like this is they're going to be replaced by a 5th Challengers team, which I believe Ronnie Intel said 5 Fears is expected to be the team to replace them, which that sucks. They finished top 6 at Challengers finals along with Royal Spartans, which if I'm Royal Spartans, I am pissed that we were not invited to EWC and that 5 Fears might be. So anything else on the Carolina deal like that? I guess we should probably just talk about their roster changes in general while we're on the topic, because we don't know anything really about F dot. Um, Obviously, we know Afro from a year and more ago because he didn't really play in the CDL this year. And then they also add Cobra, who, I mean, it's not like we're huge Challengers viewers, so I haven't really been keeping up on how he's been doing. But it seems like an interesting roster. I don't know how it would stack up against the CDL teams, and unfortunately, we don't really get to see that at EWC. So, what do you think about their changes in general?
Yeah, that I mean, for starters, these aren't official
Yeah.
changes, and now that's the biggest question, um, heading into a in a world where Carolina officially doesn't get to compete at EWC. Do these roster plans just get scrapped entirely, and then they enter a full, uh, rebuild ahead of the 2026 season, or are they gonna try to uh, enter 2026 with this roster that they put together for EWC? I could really see them going down both routes. Um, on one hand, I think the biggest thing for Carolina really, and what I mentioned beforehand was Gwynn had to be the center of roster conversations with Carolina, and I felt like building around him, uh, retaining him and then building around him was the most logical path for him to go down. But obviously, if his contract is up, he gets an offer from Cloud9, then you're back to square one. And um, if that's out the window, then you can go in basically any direction that you really want if you're Carolina. And I do think, kind of ironically, and silver lining here, I guess you can look at it, if they don't get to compete at EWC, they do get this opportunity to, um, kind of start their 2026 off season a little bit sooner than some of these other teams, because some of these other teams are going to EWC, especially if there's that 3/4 roster rule that we're hearing about. They could only make one change. Carolina's in a position now they can do whatever they want with the players available to them, and they can take that opportunity to sign this potential roster, because if they thought it was going to be good enough for EWC, then it's possible they want to, uh, you know, enter 2026 with at least some of these names. But it's also possible they were trying to go to EWC and just evaluate the talent that was available. We saw them last year. They went to EWC with Beans, and obviously Beans ends up on Toronto. So I'm not sure. I could definitely see Carolina just fully scrapping these entire plans, which would, especially for someone like Afro, he kind of mentioned like the whole uh the issue around getting European visas and whatnot for CDL teams, making it really hard for European players to be mid-season pickups, and now this happens. Like, it's just that's got to be tough to deal with all that. So someone like Afro, even Cobra, F dot, they're going to be players who are going to try to want to get something done in terms of roster situations before the next season starts, and it could be a blessing in disguise if um you know this situation gives them more time to talk to some other teams. It could also backfire though if some of these other potential teams go to EWC and their rosters that they put together perform really well, and they're just like, yeah, we're gonna um stick with the squad that just played at EWC, that sort of thing. So I'm not trying to be a little bit seesaw back and forth here, but I'm looking at it from both perspectives, and I can see it going down in multiple ways for the players and this team.
I also think it's really interesting that it was these three players in particular, because they're all European players. They all competed, I believe, in the European Challenger scene this season. So I just wonder what the scouting process was like for these players, and how they thought that he would, or that they would fit with Slasher. Obviously, having played I believe, with all American players this year, which obviously isn't that big a deal, like if they speak English, but just the idea that they didn't really get to see these players outside of the LAN tournaments get to play against other top challengers players or other former CDL players that were in challengers. So I think that's pretty interesting, and it probably, you know, just presumably leads me to believe that they think that this is a roster that they can keep throughout the entire offseason and go into the next season with. But, we'll see what happens. It's a long offseason, and if other teams are interested in these players, and who knows if they've actually been signed to long-term deals by Carolina, or if it was just more, hey, we're going to sign you for EWC, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. But, you know, we'll check back in, I guess, with Carolina. They're going to have, like you said, a longer off season than expected, and a longer off season than any of these other CDL teams. I do want to talk about Cloud9 though, because it's jumping off of the Gwen point. That is a really great signing for them.
Oh yeah.
C9 obviously had a horrible season this year, did not make champs. One of the 4 teams that did not. Very up and down. They made a few roster changes near the end of the year, and now they bring in Gwyn. They drop Capsidal as a result, which sucks for Cap because he got whatever 5 weeks out of it, or 6 weeks, however long that was. But obviously, when you don't make champs, I think everybody's probably on the chopping block at least a little bit for C9, and I'd be interested to see what they do after EWC, unless they do very, very well at Esports World Cup, and then I think they probably stick. Overall, what do you think of Cloud9's acquisition or signing of Gwyn, who probably had his best LAN performance of his career at champs?
Yeah, I love the move. I think it opens a lot of possibilities for Cloud9 going forward, assuming that this isn't just, Gwen signing a deal just for EWC. Um, for a player like Gwen, you assume that he's now signed to Cloud9 for at least next season. And I think that does open up multiple interesting opportunities for Cloud9 in the sense of they can kind of adapt the what I was hoping for Carolina, or saying that Carolina should do in building around Gwen for the upcoming season. It also opens the opportunity for them to retain Sib as well, and then you have a pretty solid 1-2 punch there, at least in terms of an AR and an SMG. Both players that are known for really strong slaying, and then you can kind of put the pieces around them in terms of a more supportive flex player or a more supportive SMG player, do the dirty work sort of thing. I could even see someone like Kismet, like a Kiz Gwyn SMG duo. Just thinking off the top of my head, that'd be kind of good. And Kiz and Sib already have a little bit of chemistry there for the year they spent playing together. So, um, yeah, I just think it's a really solid move for Cloud9 in terms of bettering their position in EWC and in terms of looking towards next season. Again, looking at it from both sides, though, it is very possible that Sib could be one of the more popular AR players, depending on his contract status in ROSTERMANIA. So it remains to be seen if Sib will be on Cloud9 next year. But this is, a chance for Cloud9 to see what a duo of Sib and Gwyn can produce. Um, I, like you too. I do think it's unfortunate for Capsidal. He doesn't get to play more than like the month that he got with Cloud9, because they definitely, especially in S&D, um, excuse me, especially in Search, the Capital Spart, Kremp, and Sib C9 squad seem to be playing well, and everyone who listens regularly knows what I think about teams that perform well in Search. So I would have liked to see them get a shot to play together at EWC. I think a part of that Ronnie Intel report um, on Carolina is that Five Fears team um, could be looking to sign Capsidal, as their one roster change because one of their players was signed by Toronto. So it is possible we do get to see Capsule, and I'd be happy for him. He gets a chance to showcase what he's been doing all year and whatnot, and especially a good opportunity for it's an opportunity for Capsule, but it's an opportunity for all these players ahead of the upcoming offseason to showcase what they can potentially bring to a team next year. But yeah, overall, uh, A+ signing of Gwyn for Cloud9 in my book. I really like it. What they do from here with it in terms of either just building around Gwyn or keeping Sib and Gwen and getting two other players. I mean, maybe if they play well at this event, they keep Kremp and or Spart too. So lots of interesting avenues they could go down here. But I think getting a player like Gwen, the rookie of the year from last year, and locking him up at least seemingly uh, ahead of any potential other stuff, I think that's a really smart move, and I like it.
The more roster changes that happen, the more I seem to like EWC and this idea of a month after champs, a month after, what we consider the season to be after it ends, then you have another big high money tournament that lacks the prestige but makes up for it by offering millions of dollars in prize winnings and therefore gets the attention of these players and teams. To have that event happen a month afterwards kind of gives these teams a time to reflect on the season and decide, okay, we're going to tweak a thing here or there. We're going to make this roster change, and we're essentially going to use EWC as like a scouting area, like a scouting tournament. Like, we're going to just see what we have at this tournament, and maybe we figure out that we actually have something really special and we're able to kind of roll with it through the the next season and stuff. But I think that could be what C9 does, because they have a very interesting roster in my opinion. Sib, Kremp, Spart, and Gwyn. Obviously Spart was out of the CDL for a few years, but Kremp showed a lot of promise, not this past season necessarily, but last season with LAT, especially at the end of the year. Sib, I think is probably the best player, or was the best player for C9 pretty notably this past season. And then Gwyn was probably the best player for Carolina. So then you start to think maybe this could work. Maybe there is something there. But I guess EWC is probably going to be the proving ground for a lot of that. If they're able to prove that there is something there, then maybe they do keep this roster moving forward. But like you said, they could make a roster change and bring in someone like Gwyn, maybe one of the Toronto guys, because obviously Toronto usually makes their players restricted free agents almost after each season. So that could be an option for C9. There are other potential roster moves that they could make. I think Kenny in a certain version of this roster to bring some kind of veteran presence to an otherwise pretty young and inexperienced team. He could be an option, but I think a lot of it just depends on how they perform at EWC, and then they can kind of move from there. But like you said, Toronto made a change as well. They brought in Abe from 5 years in the challenger scene. He's only 19 years old. He just turned 19 a few weeks ago. It would seem that once you get called up to the CDL at any point before your 21st birthday, that typically means that somebody does feel very good about your potential as a player, because teams are not too gung-ho to get challengers players in the room no matter what. But he played with Exceed, Hixie, and Fire, all former CDL players. Exotic was their coach for Challengers Finals. Obviously, I know absolutely nothing about him other than the facts that I just said, but I'm interested to see how it works out for Toronto. Beans is out of the team. I think that was to be expected, right? Especially with how they did not perform nearly as well at champs as they did throughout the regular season. I think they finished 3rd in the regular season standings. It just didn't end up working out at champs that way. And of course, people have, rightfully been talking about the Mercules situation and how it all played out, even though, at least allegedly, according to the Toronto CEO or the Toronto owner, that was not entirely on them because he just waited out his deal and then signed with Optic as a smart, 18, 19-year-old kid probably should do in that scenario. But do you have any inkling about Toronto's move or just in general about Beans being replaced?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that last part there. Is now, it's no fault of his own, but
Mm-mm.
Abe, in some capacity at least, as long as he is in this position as the player replacing Beans here, he'll have some connection or draw some comparison to Mercules. And um, I don't know much about Abe. I do know that he was a part of the Stallions, which is obviously Zuma's Challengers team. I'm pretty sure, at least according to COD Gamepedia, he had a couple stints there, and that's where I heard his name before. But outside of that, I really don't know much about him. Um, but it would be, you know, no, I don't even really want to say what I'm about to say because it's just putting unnecessary pressure on a kid that we really don't know much about. But you know, looking ahead, like it would be pretty cool if Abe has a super strong debut, and then we kind of just have this like narrative of like Mercules replacing Beans, and then goes on to be a world champ. Obviously, Abe replacing Beans, and you know he does whatever he ends up doing. Like that would just be cool to the extent of like we talked about it really with Mercules and the whole situation of whether you sign him, keep him on the bench or whatever. If you're Toronto, it's like if a situation arose, I remember saying this because we didn't know what the visa situation for Beans would be like. Like, we were saying, like, if his visa situation isn't resolved for Major Four or whatever, like, how likely are you to strike gold with another emergency sub? And if Toronto's able to do it twice, not obviously very different situations, but that has to at least speak volumes to Toronto's ability to evaluate this amateur talent and identify um, who can be next up and whatnot. So that's jumping the gun a little bit, and because I haven't even really seen Abe play. But based on what Mercules did in his short stint with Toronto, and then based on what Joe DeCease really did all year with Toronto, and even dating further back to that, they had scrap. You got to show some love to Hicksy too because Hicksy comes in and wins right away with that squad. Um, so Toronto's had some success with identifying amateur talent, and as we've talked about with their whole, at least from the outside looking in, the contract situation where they seemingly allow all their players to be restricted free agents, and then in the case of like Insight and Kleenex, they end up coming back, but in other cases, those some players don't. Like, being able to identify successful amateur players to sign is an important component of that because if you're just letting your team go, look at their options, and then you're not able to replace them with anyone competent, then that strategy really falls through. So, excited to see what Abe can do. It is kind of, looking in hindsight now, like, um, the definitive answer, I think there's no way around it saying that, I think Toronto really wishes they were able to hold on to Mercules in that whole situation after Major 3. Um, but most interesting thing that I can talk about with this situation is Joe DeCeves saying that Kleenex is the flex for Toronto, which is very interesting to me because you think about Kleenex, he's always got an SMG in his hand. Um, so I'm excited to see what he can do. Now it's very possible that um, on some of these maps and maybe this is we talked about this way earlier in the season with like Priesta and Skies on LAG where they started to play Skyline because they were able to get Priest on that third SMG and they started to see a little success when it was Lynn's Kismet and Priesta all running the SMGs. So maybe this is a case where, Kleenex is the quote unquote flex and we just see Toronto's map pool start to cater to some of these three SMG maps, but it's also possible that we just see Kleenex using an AR more, and I think that's interesting. It's, again, it's not what I think about when I think about Kleenex as a player and the tissue being an issue. But maybe this is the next step in his career. And again, it comes at a time where we don't know the contract situation for him and whatnot. Maybe this is him potentially showcasing what he can offer to a team beyond just being the SMG presence that most teams have come to know him as over these last few years. So I'm excited to see what Kleenex can do in the flex role as well.
It might just be also a practical solution because usually there are much more competent submachine gun players in general. So if they can bring Kleenex into a flex role, or even obviously like in a perfect world, he just becomes like this superstar AR player, and then they could start to target other SMG players to kind of complement like Joe. Like Joe obviously is the super fast one, so maybe Abe will complement Joe even better than Kleenex did, which doesn't seem like that possible to be honest, because Kleenex is one of the better SMG players in the world. But if he's able to kind of translate that success over to being an AR, if Abe is, obviously a lot of ifs here, but if Abe is able to be a pretty good SMG next to Joe, that team's really good. Like, Insight had probably his worst tournament of his life at Champs, which is unfortunate, and it did not endear himself to the broader COD community, who love Joe and Kleenex and like what they've been able to accomplish in general. But if he is able to kind of just come back up to the level that he has been at for many years now, then that team's really good. Like, I don't know if they're like a world championship roster. That probably depends on how good Abe truly is, but it's worth a shot. And again, this is kind of EWC being an experimental ground for these teams that they were never going to do this at Champs. They were never going to be like, okay, Kleenex, you're going to be a the flex player for Champs. They're going to be like, afterward, like we care about this tournament, but it's about more the long-term future and maybe finding a different way of doing things than they did things all throughout the past season. So I'm interested, just like you, to see what Kleenex has to offer. If he is half as good as an AR as he is a submachine gun player, like that's a really scary sight to see. Another move I think we should talk about, because it kind of relates, is LAG, because I just think of like LAG and Toronto because of some of the connections that they've had in the past. Obviously, Marky B, formerly being part of the LAG coaching staff, he was kind of like one of the architects with the original Toronto rosters before he went to LA. But they also made a roster change, actually a few roster changes. They dropped Fellow and more notably Linz. Obviously, Linz being the only French player for LAG, which is now owned by Gentlemates, a French organization. In place of Fellow, Linz was on the bench. In place of Fellow, Diamond Con is coming into the lineup. He was with New York, and I think he might have played for LAG, or was he the player that was left out of LAG at that one time? So he was with LAG, right?
He was at some point, yeah.
I think that was like 2022 or 2023. But he's had a few shots at the CDL. I always thought he seemed like a pretty good AR player, not like a superstar by any means, but it did feel kind of weird that he was left out of a lot of CDL rosters over the years, and he's done pretty well in challengers since then. He's replacing Fellow. I like Fellow. I just think this is probably the last time that we see him on a CDL roster, like at least for a while. We talked about it when he came into LAG the first time, or in the first place this season, where he's been with half of the teams currently in the league, and at some point you run out of teams to really sign with, especially when some of the top teams are obviously not looking for him. But LAG is also making a lot of changes behind the scenes. D-Real and Marky B. D-Real was the head coach. Marky B was an assistant coach, if I'm not mistaken. And they both announced like a day or two after Champs, if I'm not mistaken, that they were looking for new opportunities this offseason which I thought was pretty interesting because LAG this last offseason bring in D-Real, who was the head coach of New York Subliners. They bring pretty much that entire roster minus Hydra over from NYSL. And now a year later, it seems like they're completely scrapping the idea of that team and that roster construction. So, what do you think about all of this with LAG?
Yeah, I really think, in complete opposite way as what I'm thinking for Carolina, although again for Carolina they could go in multiple directions, but for LAG here, I think this is just a one event thing where they're bringing in Diamond Con and they're looking at all these players individually, and I think that they're just going to blow it up after this event and look for a clean slate. Ronnie Intel tweeted that VOs is being looked at as the new GM for the team, reportedly. He had ties to LAG previously, and Mayhem, uh, assistant coach for Carolina this past year. He had some other coaching experience as well.
Toronto, I think.
Um, what was that?
I think it was Toronto. I'm pretty sure he was under Marky B for a while.
Okay. Yeah, I do remember. I think it might have been the LAG with Marky B actually, but regardless, he's had some coaching experience, and I like Mayhem was one of those players who, uh, he was always down to chat in the DMs when I just had quick questions or whatever back when he was competing. So that's a fun throwback for me. But he's being reportedly targeted as the potential head coach for this team. And if they're already just looking at new GMs and head coaches, it doesn't really make sense for them to you know, not get the shot to put together their own team as opposed to like being handed this team that struggled last year. So I do expect Gentlemates to have a very different team in 2026 than test 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 test.
Only gone for like
It's working on
20,
Twitch.
30 seconds, I think.
All right. So what was the last thing you heard me saying?
I think you said fun fact, and then you went out.
Oh, you missed all that. Okay. I was rambling about the Gotaga thing.
Yeah,
And
I didn't hear anything about Gotaga.
okay. Um shit.
You just talked about Mayhem,
Yeah.
answering
Okay.
questions and
All right.
stuff.
I'll figure it out. So, all right, 3, 2. So I do think there's the report going around of new GM VOs for LAG Gentlemates and new head coach Mayhem potentially, reportedly, all that good stuff. It wouldn't make sense, in my opinion, if the Gentlemates organization or higher ups is looking for these new GM head coach people, and then they handed them a team from the past season that didn't perform well. So I am just expecting this EWC to be looked at as an experimental phase, like to evaluate individual talent, and then I expect the slate to be wiped clean, and the new GM and head coach, if they are officially confirmed and whatnot, they should be given the opportunity to build their own team. That's at least in my mind how it should work out. Um, but we'll have to see how it all plays out and whatnot. I did think it was interesting. Breaking Point shared a clip of Gotaga talking about uh, looking back at the season for General Mates and whatnot. And it seemed like at some point he mentioned something about the team towards the end of the year, like either playing for stats or maybe trying to pad their stats in an effort to stay in the league for next season. And I thought that was funny. It was it's something we've talked about and the COD community have talked about over the years as like some people might try to do that to save face or save their stock or whatever the case may be. But I don't think we've ever really had like an owner come straight out and say it. So if he's thinking it, then that in my case, like in my mind, that has me thinking that he's kind of just like, he wants to move on from this season, and that makes me believe that um, we'll get a completely new squad for Gentlemates in 2026.
I just thought it was interesting that Vios and Mayhem in particular were brought in because they,
Allegedly.
or yes, reportedly or whatever. But Vios coached Team War at Challengers Finals. The roster Diamond Con, Assault, Two Real, and Lens, which I just thought that was interesting. And the crossover is that Mayhem and Vios have both coached Diamond Con when I believe Diamond Con was on, or pretty much all this season. Vios coached Diamond Con, so that's kind of like the connection
Hey,
of. Well,
yeah,
you just don't usually see it in COD esports.
yeah,
Usually, that's something you see in traditional sports, where like a football coach brings it, like gets hired, and like what's the first thing he does? He brings in like his backup quarterback that he always has, or
yeah.
like his offensive coordinator that he always has. You usually don't see that in competitive COD, but Diamond Con and these guys seem to have a pretty close relationship at least, and that I'm not judging that. I just think it's very unique that it's actually happening, because even dating back to when Vios was the very criticized head coach of the infamous LAG team that turned out to be much better than people thought they would be. Diamond Con was also on that team, which I think is pretty interesting. So was Fame, Estriel, and Flames. So I just, I think it's intriguing that this is how it's going down.
No, I didn't even think about it from that perspective. And if I'm gonna put on like a Gotaga hat here, and you know, again, we don't know for sure about the whole Vios and Mayhem situation, but like if you're the owner for a team and you bring in a new GM and coach and you want to see like what they're going to bring to the table, especially going into an event where you can only make one move, it's like, okay, you guys can go make a move, and those guys are going to target someone like Diamond Con and who they have this pre-existing relationship with, and that can be like the thing where like these guys are like, okay, we want Diamond Con to be a part of Gentlemates moving forward. Gotaga can be like, okay, you got a shot here to show me what he can do at EWC, and if he doesn't produce or whatever, then we're gonna go a different direction for 2026. But if he does play well, then you guys have the building blocks for at least 25% of your roster for the next season. So I didn't think about it from that perspective. That is interesting. I do think, end of the day, I think Kismet in particular, as much as we've hyped him up over the years and whatnot. I think he is going to be a hot commodity for other teams. I just don't see him being on Gentlemates next year, just based on the lack of results this year. I do think he has a future still in the CDL, and I think the other teams would be pretty stupid to pass up on the chance to get him if he becomes available. And then Lunars and Johnny are both, in my opinion, in a position where unless they light the world on fire at EWC, they might be back in the pit next year to start the season.
This relationship goes far deeper than I even thought. Vio's first time coaching Diamond Con was in November 2022 during the first Challengers North American Cup of MW2. So it's been almost 3 years, and I don't think they've been separated at all in 3 years, which is an incredible length of time to be connected, player to coach, coach to player. But again, not judging that at all. I think it's fascinating, in all honesty, and I think of it in a way as Diamond Con being like a control variable in this team of like Vios knows exactly what he is capable of and maybe what he is not capable of, and he can slot him in. He knows what he will contribute, and then he can kind of judge these players more honestly because he doesn't have to judge Diamond Con like he is a known quantity at that point. Everybody else, it's just how they fit around him. At least for this tournament, maybe it won't be a long-term thing, but I think that's a really fun way to kind of evaluate a team, especially if it is just for this tournament, and then they go into the off season more with an open mind. I still think that they should bring back Kismet. Like if that is, I just don't see another player that they could realistically get that would be better when he is at his best. Like, he is
Yeah.
by far one of the best SMGs in the entire league. This season was kind of an abomination from that entire team. They were one of the 5 or 6 worst teams in Call of Duty League history. So I just don't think that he should be necessarily judged as harshly, considering what we've seen of him the last few years. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess, to see what LAG ends up doing with both their coaching staff and their roster after EWC. And then I think the last CDL roster change that we have to talk about is Vegas. We briefly mentioned it, but TJ replaces Priesta in the Vegas Falcons roster. And as a result, Exnid is now moving to the flex position for Vegas. So this is a pretty interesting team for the Falcons. I don't know how well they're going to be able to compete. They were mostly down near the end of the season, but they had some kind of bright moments as well. Pred is, still think one of the most talented players in the league. TJ was a really consistent player overall for Carolina this year, and I think surprised some people for how consistent he was, even though the end of the season was horrible for that team. We'll see what happens with varsities. Like, he's like one of those players that is kind of auditioning in a way, it feels like, for not only Vegas but other CDL teams that might be interested in an AR player this offseason. And then obviously Exnid, we talked about it before, I don't think he's really at risk of being moved out of this roster unless the Falcons organization just has a complete change of heart and doesn't believe that they need even one Saudi player on this team. So it does feel like the tournament that Arstes, maybe TJ, maybe not. Pred, I don't think he has anything to prove necessarily to Vegas, because if they don't want him, there will certainly be a bunch of other teams that will jump on that and try to sign him this offseason. So what do you think about TJ coming into Vegas?
Yeah, it's a move that, I think Brett and TJ have been pretty friendly over the years. They've been a part of some of those like NBA 2K matches I've seen with like Scrap too and stuff like that. So I'm not really surprised to see them finally team up in an opportunity like this where, it potentially could only be a one tournament thing. Unlike the Gwyn and Cloud9 situation, again, not without knowing how the contract stuff works, I would be very surprised if Vegas signed TJ like to a long-term deal or a deal beyond EWC. I just think that doesn't make sense for Vegas if everything we know and have heard is true about what they potentially could do in terms of spending big in the offseason. It wouldn't make sense to me to potentially sign TJ for the 2026 season if they're looking to spend big on other free agents and whatnot. So not sure how that aligns with their future plans and whatnot, but as you mentioned, like the Kleenex and going to flex situation for Toronto, I am interested in the XNID to flex situation for Vegas because, like you said, I think this will allow them to evaluate XNID a little bit more. It seems like he is going to be a part of their plans regardless of, what happens. But if he is able to move to a flex role, then that kind of opens the door up for some of these other big name potential free agents and whatnot. And if you can get another big name SMG player, someone like, let's just say Kismet, for example, like obviously there are bigger names like Simp and Abizi if they potentially become free agents, but just because we were just talking about LAG, like if XNID stays on an SMG and Pred stays on the team, then you're just locked into looking for 2 ARs for 2026. But if XNID can be an effective flex player, then that gives you some wiggle room in terms of what options you have for players to sign, and then you could go after someone like Kismet, which I think a Kismet and Pred duo would be kind of interesting, because then Pred again can just do whatever he wants on the map and slay, and Kismet's going to do your dirty work and your OBJ and whatnot. So I've kind of just in a spur of the moment talked myself into thinking a Pred and Kismet duo would be kind of electric. But regardless, I think that's the most important um, way of looking at this Vegas change, is less about TJ coming into the picture and more about evaluating what Xnig can do on a flex to potentially open the door for Vegas in terms of roster construction for 2026. Now, that's not to say if TJ plays well with Pred, they could look to, keep that team together, and then maybe they're in a position where they just spend even more on an AR player, someone, let's just say, there's the rumors around Atlanta FaZe, like someone like Celium. If Celium becomes available in the offseason and they just throw a giga bag at him, and TJ played well enough where they're like, okay, we can do TJ, Pred, Exnet, and Celium, like, hey, maybe that. So I just think for Vegas, this move of getting TJ in the mix and getting Xnid on the flex roll is more about evaluating what their options look like for the upcoming offseason, as opposed to necessarily making a move to win the whole thing at EWC.
Yeah, I think it's a good stopgap move. Like, just
Yeah.
TJ is an upgrade over Priesta. Like, it doesn't really matter like how much it's an upgrade, and you just need to field a better roster to better evaluate or more accurately evaluate all these other players. And I actually think this is like one of the most logical moves that they could have made, at least at this point in the season or before EWC. And it kind of follows the trend of a lot of these teams, like C9 making one move, Gwen for Capstone. That's a great move. Like, that is a definite upgrade. LAG, I think, is like, if it's not an upgrade, it at least gives you something to think about with DiamondCon instead of Fellow, because I think Fellow is by far a known quantity at this point. So, like, what are you learning necessarily about Fellow? And then Abe and Beans, like, I have absolutely no idea if Abe is anything. So, like, that's a risk, especially with the Kleenex Flex idea coming into play. But I think it's worth the risk for Toronto to see if they have accurately identified a top young talent. And then this move here is like Priesta. I think I said it at the time when Vegas signed him and Aristides. It's like, okay, like, I mean, that's like a really uninspired move to bring in these two guys who have struggled to stay in the CDL or struggled to get back into the CDL. It felt like kind of a meh move. And I think TJ is not the most flashy player by any means, but I think he's better than Priesta, and they might be better as a team, Vegas is, just by that alone. So I'm kind of intrigued by it, but I very much want Vegas to be a big spender in free agency regardless of how well this team does. I would like to see them at least start throwing out some cash, maybe approach the FaZe guys or the Optic guys or the LAT guys and say, like, which of you three want to come to Vegas and play with Pred? That's my dream, because if I was a filthy rich esports team owner, that is exactly what I would do. I would be going to every single major player and offering them a massive bag to come play with Pred. I don't know if that's going to happen this offseason, but that is my dream, and I'm going to keep dreaming it. The only other change was not a CDL change necessarily. They're a former CDL player, but Team Orchid, who qualified for EWC, they made this roster change where they added Beans, who obviously was replaced by Abe in Toronto. Beans replaces Henry. And I said this when we started the show, or before, just as we went live. And I think that's messed up. I don't think this should be allowed. I understand if a player's contract expires and he leaves a team. I kind of understand that, although I do think that they should work it out that EWC is part of the contract no matter what. The contract expires the day after EWC. I do not care, but I think in general it should be a part of it. In this specific scenario where Henry was a part of a challengers team that earned their way to challenge to EWC, unlike the CDL teams that were automatically invited, I think that's really screwed up. I think it is incredibly unfair to Henry. I don't know him. I never met the guy. I don't know what he looks like at all. Just by principle, it is screwed up to exclude a player that was a fourth of the reason that you were even going to EWC. And that's no blame to Beans. Like, he is also in a weird situation where he plays an entire CDL season with the team and then they drop him before EWC. I don't know what the solution is, but it certainly needs to be resolved next season where these challengers teams cannot just change their roster like this. Like, Henry, unless he gets picked up by a CDL team, I don't think that's going to happen. We haven't heard any reports of that. But other than that, like, it's just a screwed up situation. I don't think they should allow it. They shouldn't allow it this season, and they certainly shouldn't allow it next season. What do you think?
Yeah, that's really where my head's at, is that, especially for these challengers teams that, like, you look at, I don't even know if this is really a great comparison, but just the thing that I'm like comparing it to in my head is if this was more for like qualifying for the pro league or something like that, and like some really good pro became available, and then you're the amateur team who qualified for the tournament to qualify for the pro league, and then you're able to make one change to try and give you a shot to become pros. Like, I could kind of see it in that scenario. It would still be super messed up for the one player who, doesn't get that opportunity to go to that next level. um but that's really like the only thing I'm thinking about in my head that could be like, I'd kind of be a little more okay with it, where it's like these guys, they grinded. It sucks for that one other individual, but for the other three guys on the team, they are making a move to try and like take this thing from being an amateur to a professional. Little different with these. Obviously, Bance is on this team, who's one of the best European Call of Duty players of all time. Um, so it's not a great comparison, and EWC isn't like some qualifying tournament, and like we've said, um, as far as the way from the outside looking in, it feels like a lot of people are looking at this tournament as just like an extra throw in at the end of the year and an opportunity to evaluate talent and an opportunity for some of these amateurs to play against the pro teams and to showcase potentially what they can do ahead of the major offseason before the next season. And if that's what EWC is supposed to be, then it's messed up for someone like Henry. Again, like you said, I don't know anything about him or his play style or anything. Um, but for him to qualify for EWC and then be denied that opportunity just because the team wants to bring in Beans, who was dropped, like that sucks for him. And I don't think it should be allowed for the challengers teams to, willingly make a change like this. Now, it would be a different situation if, like I was saying with like Abe, I believe Abe getting picked up by Toronto, and then if Abe's former team does end up replacing Carolina, they obviously have to make a change. Like, that's something different. Like, you know, if one of the challengers teams has a player picked up by a pro team and then they have to uh, fill the spot with somebody else, that's different than just having the four players who qualify and then just willingly dropping one of them for a former pro who became available. Um, Again, trying to look at it from both perspectives, these players and somebody like Bance, who, yes, maybe he could want to quote unquote go pro again or be in the CDL again. He could also just be looking at this as an opportunity to make as much money as he possibly can at a $1.8 million tournament or whatever it actually is. And if he and the team thinks that Beans gives them a better chance to make more money at a one tournament shot like this, I guess I can't really hate that mindset. It again sucks for Henry, And I'm not a huge fan of them being allowed to make a change just because they want to in this case. But I'm trying to look at it from both perspectives, and in that mindset, if they think Beans can get them a bigger paycheck at the end of the day, I guess that's their prerogative.
Yeah, I think I've been of the mind about, like, because this has been a long issue for not even Call of Duty esports, like CS:GO has had this problem before as well. The roster locks and qualifying for tournaments, and then there being some kind of break where teams make a change in between. I believe personally that the players themselves should earn a spot at these tournaments. So this Five Years team, or this Team Orchid team, they all four of them earn a spot. It's basically they get a golden ticket. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to play for this team, but they have to play for one of the 16 teams. So, you have 16 times 4, and my math is 64. 64 players have spots. There are no exceptions unless like a medical emergency or anything. Those 64 players, regardless of the teams, maybe, they have to be on one of those 16 teams. That's probably the way I would do it if I were CDL commissioner or running EWC, because I just think it's a really messed up thing. I also looked at Henry's Twitter. So funny, and really so funny in like a horrible way, because June 28th, let's go, qualified for EWC, GG's the Five Fears 132, so proud of my teammates. July 3rd, the very next tweet, don't even know what to say. If anyone needs one for EWC, let me know. That is Challengers in a nutshell, and that is Call of Duty esports in a nutshell, where your life could basically change in a matter of 5-6 days, and not for the better. I feel bad for him. There have been many other players throughout the history of Call of Duty esports that have had similar experiences. There should be a pretty easy solution somewhere, some way. It just has not been instituted whatsoever for at least COD. I don't know if any other esport has figured it out more cleanly, but yeah, it's unfortunate. We'll see what Beans can do with Team Orchid, and I don't know if there is like a challengers team that people are necessarily expecting to kind of make waves at EWC. Last year we didn't really have anything, obviously, because like even what was it? Even Boston was able to win like a match or two at EWC, which was kind of an indictment on like the teams there at that tournament. We'll see if things work out better for them at 2025 EWC. You want to talk about some of this other stuff before we get out of here?
Only thing I think we need to talk about that I realized like right after we ended our 2 hour plus long champs recap. The only thing we didn't really mention during that was the viewership of champs. So I think that's all we have to talk about here, and then we can get out of here.
Yeah. So according to esports charts, which they do all of the esports event viewership figures, they clocked the peak viewers of Optic Texas versus Vancouver Surge in the 2025 CDL Champs Grand Finals as 353,525 viewers, which is the highest peak viewership for Call of Duty esports history. That seems... that doesn't seem right, but I can't remember a time that there would have been more. I do believe that 2020 Champs had... I think it set the peak viewers record or reset the peak viewers record. But that is pretty crazy that this event, this year, with how much criticism the CDL has gotten, how kind of lackluster the regular season felt at times, that Optic just making this run through champs can kind of erase a lot of that at the end.
That's the power of the green wall.
Yeah, that's why we like when we were working at Dot, it's like you kind of want Optic to go far and go deep into these tournaments, because it not only boosts viewership, it boosts readership, it boosts social media. It literally does everything. It's like all tides raise boats, or whatever the saying is, and the green wall is able to do that. And I mean, rightfully so. Like this was a this was also an incredible grand finals as well. Like this wasn't
Yeah.
a 5-0 stomp. This was a very competitive series in general. Any other thoughts on the viewership record?
Yeah, so if you look at the reply to
Mm-hmm.
the CDL Intel tweet, it lists some of the other peak viewers there, and it has the top one it has is the COD Next Showcase for Black Ops 6 had 836,000 viewers. Cold War multiplayer reveal was 800K. NW3 Tournament Old School, which maybe is a Hitch thing. I'm not entirely sure. That's 439,000. So whatever that is, they're just not counting that as like quote unquote esports or whatever. So that's interesting. But then after that is the COD Champs Finals from 2025. The names following COD Champs 2025 at 353K is Kason's MW2 Halloween Showdown at 341,000. Which if that's like Kason tournament being the highest viewed esports tournament previously, that's kind of wild to think about. Then after that, the highest CDL tournament would have been 2023 Stage 3 Major, which I don't remember who would have won that, but maybe, with that
Maybe it was
viewership,
Optic.
Optic was most likely involved.
Major 3 was hosted by Optic, and Optic finished second. They lost in the
Okay.
grand finals to Toronto Ultra in 6 games.
Okay. So that explains that. But then the one you were talking about, COD Champs 2020 Finals at 331,000. And the CWL COD Champs 2018, the event we met each other at, where Aches won his second ring. That's the final event listed here at 324,000 viewers, and that's kind of interesting because that's a case where Optic
No,
literally
they did.
got
Yeah.
eliminated in top 24. So,
Very notably not in
um,
the grand finals of that event.
yeah, and I guess you can say the same for 2020 COD Champs
Yeah.
Finals, but that's like the first of the CDL era, and I'm pretty sure they had some pretty big watch parties for that. I think maybe even Doctor Disrespect did one. I think Tim the Tatman did one. Um, I know Noah J did one. That was like the first CDL year, and I remember like talking about it at that time that they were like reaching out to other people with general COD audiences trying to get more viewers um on that. So yeah, that's rambling there, long list of viewership numbers, but like you said, and I think that's pretty much the main takeaway here is that for as much as even we and a lot of the community have groaned and moaned about this past season and all the difficulties and the challenges and whatnot, end of the day, it's, ends up being the most watched tournament with Optic taking it home after having a lackluster season. So, um, what that says about the state of COD esports and
Yeah, that's
whatnot,
where I was going.
and you can really take it in multiple directions. It's really, you know, it shows the importance of Optic if that's ever been doubted and whatnot. But you do have those examples below it where, um, non-Optic tournaments were in close vicinity to the viewership numbers of this event. Um, but it also shows that COD esports isn't dead, and there is room to grow. And I think, objectively speaking, like sure, Optic helped, but as we got Scump and Zuma doing watch parties, Breaking Point doing watch parties, and stuff like that. As we're able to grow those audiences, that just feeds into the bigger audience supporting and tuning into these events. And I think that's you got to look at that as a positive overall. So um, I guess we'll have to see. I mean, for multiple reasons, people are excited to see what Optic can do at EWC if they can repeat the success from champs. But we'll have to see how the viewership stacks up in comparison if Optic is able to make a similar run.
Yeah, I'll keep my thoughts brief because we are at
Yeah.
an hour 15, hour and 20. I think it's important that you said like Call of Duty is not dead. Like it is not in a good place. Like in general, there is a lot of really bad or just like lackluster aspects to COD Esports and the CDL, and really everything below the CDL like is, rotten essentially. But there is hope that there can be this kind of boom in viewership and the return of sponsors. I think it was Jacob Hale tweeted that he noticed that there are only 3 sponsors listed for the CDL, and I think one of them is Monster, the other is EWC, and Scuff. So like those are the 3 sponsors, and you think about the number of sponsors or partners that former Call of Duty events used to have, even the ones that weren't directly affiliated with Activision. I think that's interesting to think about, and maybe if viewership keeps going up, or if there are more events like this where 3 to 400,000 people are watching at peak, maybe there will be more sponsors that get interested again in Call of Duty. It is going to take Optic. Like I think that's been very obvious for like pretty much my entire time in Call of Duty esports. Like there are moments where it is non-Optic and that teams are basically, or moments are able to be like generated without the support of Optic. But in general, this esport kind of lives and dies on how well Optic is doing. I think that's pretty usual, pretty typical for nascent sports competitions or sports leagues. If you look like in the NBA, like the very early days of the NBA, the Boston Celtics won all of the championships basically, and the NBA was not very popular until the late 70s. It took 20, 30, almost 40 years for the league to do anything, and it took like this rivalry between the Lakers and Celtics, and obviously it blew up into a giant thing. The NFL was famously not super popular like when it first arrived. Like the first few Super Bowls were not like these big events, and over time it just became to be like really the biggest sporting event of like annual sporting event, not including like the World Cup or anything. So like there is some kind of hope for Call of Duty esports, obviously not to be on that level, but to be like competitive with even something like CSGO majors or League of Legends tournaments like MSI. Worlds is probably a different thing considering the international implications of some of those tournaments and how big and grand they can be. But I think the CDL has a lot of potential. That's why it is always so frustrating when we talk about these things and we're like, they should do these things, and then they never do any of them. And that's kind of where I think the frustration comes from a lot of times. But it is going to take Optic. It is going to take them to be a very competitive team, even if they don't win necessarily, because I think that can help, especially if there is like another rivalry akin to Aches and Nadeshot, which I think was pretty formative for a lot of Call of Duty fans, at least my age, or that got involved in COD esports around that time. Scrap and Draza is kind of interesting, but they have not played each other nearly enough on LAN for my liking. Optic also just doesn't have like a super heated rivalry with anybody that I can really think of, like Shotzi versus the World when he decides to stream scrims. But other than that, there isn't like some Optic versus Complexity kind of rivalry, or Complexity versus Impact, or FaZe versus Optic during like AW or anything. So just there isn't that. Eventually, I think there will be, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. But it's going to take a lot of work, probably a lot of time, and quite a bit of luck, as is the case with every major professional sports league. Look at the WNBA. It was very popular when it first started, then pretty much cratered into irrelevancy, and then has become very popular in the last 2 to 3 years because it got super lucky with the specific players and how people reacted to them coming into the league. And the pipeline is not great for the CDL, not nearly as great as college basketball is for the WNBA, but hopefully it'll be figured out. Hopefully the league will be able to survive and thrive eventually. But this is a great sign, right? To have 350,000 people watching an esports tournament that is only on YouTube. Like that's pretty incredible. Like imagine what
That
this
is
could
important
have
to
been.
note. Yeah.
If they had widened it up, let people on Twitch stream it. I think that's probably the next step for this esport in general is just, hey, like we did this one season and then they were like, never again, we are going straight back to YouTube. But if it could be kind of an open community at that point where anybody can stream it, anybody can co-stream it, and they should be reaching out to Kason, Scump, Zuma, etc., as like official partners of like, we want to make sure that you guys are having the best experience you can, so the viewers that you are bringing in also have a really good experience. So that's my rant.
I'll cap it off and say I mean the Twitch is a good shout, and Scump's obviously done well for himself in terms of building the watch party on YouTube. But if he was able to watch party an Optic winning champs moment on Twitch, I wouldn't be surprised if this number was over 500,000.
Yeah, and I get the arguments against it, that it's
Yeah.
like it doesn't really help their bottom line. I mean, it's not helping their bottom line very much that they're exclusive to YouTube. So it doesn't really make a ton of financial sense either way. You might as well just open up the community and potentially expose yourself to as many potential viewers as possible, which is basically how the CSGO majors get super popular, because there are not a million regular CSGO viewers for esports, but once a major comes around and the certain storylines match up, they sometimes pass a million live viewers, and that is pretty incredible for something that doesn't have like the reach of League of Legends, which has like penetrated China, is super popular in Asia. Like CS:GO just doesn't have that kind of relevancy in Asia in particular. So we'll see what happens. I like to see it. I like I think we had our best viewership right after the CDL had their best viewership. Some might say that we caused the CDL to have great viewership, but I won't stop them. But yeah, I think that does it. I think we have a few topics that will carry over for next episode. I'm sure we'll have some, at least hopefully some confirmations in terms of the rosters, some maybe more reports. We also have some, stuff that's just been floating around Twitter that we haven't gotten to over the last week or two. But we'll talk about that more when we come back for our next episode. Please subscribe, like, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. Like Bink said, 1,000 views on our VOD for the last YouTube stream, which is amazing. I think we're well over 250 YouTube subscribers now as well. We really appreciate the love and support. It has been incredible. If you could, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and the podcast Twitters at Ego Chall Podcast. Not entirely sure when the next show will be. I think we're probably going to be like on a 1 week or one show per week basis for a little bit, just because unless we get like a ton of information all at once and consistently, like we do kind of, I think, have to pace ourselves because I don't know if we can keep on the what we did when there was no Call of Duty for the holiday break, because we were running on fumes by the time the CDL came back. Fortunately, we have EWC, which starts 2 weeks from today on July 24th. So we'll be doing some shows before then, talking about the tournaments, and obviously we'll do a preview show and do our pick'em before EWC begins. But we'll see you probably in the next week or so. Please be safe. Please enjoy the very hot weather if you are in the Midwest, which is very annoying me. But we appreciate you, and Bink, take it away.
Yep, short and sweet this time. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Like Preston said, schedule is going to be a little bit here or there till we get back into the swing of things with the actual tournament. But then right after that, we're going to be in the off season, so we'll be at the mercy of whenever reports of roster moves and there's actually stuff to talk about. That's when we'll be doing shows. So best way to keep up with us in terms of knowing when we're going live for the shows and whatnot is following on Twitter, like Preston said, or just subscribing to the YouTube channel. and getting those notifications when we do go live. So, yeah, appreciate all the support. Thank you guys as always. And remember to send the chow.